Welcome back, everyone. Tonight we're embarking on an extraordinary journey, diving deep into the earliest written records of human civilization. These aren't just ancient texts. They're humanity's first attempts to understand existence itself, carved into clay tablets long before the Egyptian pyramids ever touched the sky, before the Sphinx gazed across the desert sands, before anything we typically associate with ancient civilization had even begun. Before we start this exploration together, I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit that like button and subscribe, but only if this content genuinely resonates with you. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. There's something truly remarkable about connecting with people across continents, all of us drawn to the same ancient questions about our origins and what our ancestors truly understood. Get comfortable now. Dim those lights, maybe turn on some white noise in the background, and let's explore what the Sumerian tablets actually tell us. Not what modern interpreters want them to say, but what they reveal in their own voice, through their own symbols, before popular theories told us how to think about ancient gods and creation. Part 1. The Primordial Waters. Our story doesn't begin with spacecraft or genetic laboratories or any of the sensational imagery that has captured modern imagination. Instead, the Sumerian creation narrative opens with something far more primal and profound. Nammu. Nammu wasn't a goddess in the way we typically imagine deities today. Not a being with human form walking among mortals, not a personality with preferences and emotions you could relate to. Nammu represented something more fundamental, more elemental, the primordial ocean, the cosmic sea existing before creation itself had meaning or form. To truly understand this concept, we need to understand the Sumerian relationship with water. These people settled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in flat alluvial plains where survival depended entirely on annual flooding. When the rivers flooded properly, depositing rich silt across the fields, harvests were abundant and cities prospered. When floods came at the wrong time or with wrong intensity, famine threatened and survival became uncertain. Water was life itself to the Sumerians, not metaphorically, but literally, in the most tangible sense imaginable. So when they contemplated the origins of everything, they naturally conceived of water as the primal element, the creative matrix from which all existence emerged. Imagine not the emptiness of space as we understand it today with our telescopes and satellites, but emptiness existing before space itself, before dimensions, before up and down and left and right had any meaning. This was what the Sumerians attempted to describe with Nammu, a nothingness that simultaneously contained everything, a cosmic ocean holding all potential but manifesting, nothing, suspended in timeless waiting. The cuneiform tablets from Nippur, that sacred city in central Iraq, preserve texts dating to around 1600 BCE, but recording oral traditions thousands of years older. These sources describe Nammu as a self-generating creative force, a deity requiring no partner or consort to bring forth the universe. This detail carries profound significance when we compare Sumerian cosmology to creation myths of other ancient cultures. In most mythologies, creation requires divine marriage, a union of opposites producing something new. The Sky Father mates with Earth Mother, and from their union comes the world. But the earliest Sumerian tradition described something different. Nammu was complete unto herself, containing both creative potential and the will to actualize it. The separation of heaven and earth. From her own essence, Nammu brought forth two beings, An, representing the sky, the vast celestial dome covering the earth like an inverted bowl, and Kai, embodying the earth itself, the solid foundation for all terrestrial life. Initially, An and Ki existed in a state of unity, locked together in undifferentiated mass, in eternal embrace. The tablets describe this primordial union using language suggesting both physical proximity and metaphysical identity. There was no space between heaven and earth, no atmosphere, no realm where life could exist. From the union of An and Ki came Enlil, whose name translates approximately as Lord of the Air or Master of Breath. Enlil's role in shaping the cosmos was absolutely fundamental and necessarily violent. Creation couldn't proceed through gentle evolution or gradual development. It required rupture, a forceful breaking apart, a violent separation of what had been unified. Enlil thrust the sky upward, pushing and away from Ki, and in that violent act created the space between them, the air, the atmosphere, the realm where weather happens and birds fly and humans breathe. And was carried away to the heavens, rising upward to establish his domain in the celestial realm. Ki remained below as the foundation of the manifest world, and Enlil claimed the space between them, the air, the wind, the breath of life itself, as his particular kingdom. This three-tiered structure, heaven, earth, and the air between, formed the fundamental cosmological framework of Sumerian thought, simple in some respects, yet capturing something essential about the observable world. The time before time. The tablets speak of a time when only water existed, when boundaries between salt water and fresh water hadn't been established, when the cosmic ocean was undifferentiated and all-encompassing. In later Babylonian texts, particularly the famous Enuma Elish, this primordial water split into two distinct beings, Apsu, representing fresher underground water, and Tiamat, embodying the salt water of the sea. Their mingling produced the first generation of gods in Babylonian tradition. But in the older, Sumerian traditions, Nammu preceded even this division. She was the totality of primordial waters before any distinction had been made, before the categories structuring later cosmological thinking had been established. Part 2, Eridu, and the sacred geography archaeological evidence from excavations supports the profound antiquity of these beliefs and their connection to real geographical locations in ancient Mesopotamia. The city of Eridu, located in southern Iraq near what was once the shoreline of the Persian Gulf, was considered by the Sumerians themselves as the oldest city in the world, the first place where kingship descended from heaven, the birthplace of civilization itself. Modern excavations have confirmed that Eridu indeed represents one of the earliest urban settlements in human history, with occupation levels dating back to approximately 5400 BCE, making it contemporary with or even slightly older than the famous site of Uruk to the north. The patron deity of Eridu was Enki, god of wisdom, of fresh water that flowed beneath the earth and emerged in springs, of creation and crafts and magical knowledge. Enki occupied a special place in the Sumerian pantheon, often portrayed as cleverer than other gods, more willing to help humanity, less bound by rigid hierarchies governing divine society. He was, in some respects, a trickster figure, a subversive force who worked around the decrees of more powerful but less imaginative gods. Enki's temple at Eridu bore the name Iabzu, literally translating as House of the Cosmic Deep Waters. This wasn't merely poetic symbolism. The temple was believed to be built upon the very spot where the primordial waters of the Abzu first emerged into the terrestrial world. The Abzu, the cosmic ocean. Below, these ancient Sumerians conceived of their world as resting upon and emerging from a cosmic ocean of fresh water. This wasn't abstract theology disconnected from observable reality. It was grounded in actual environmental experience. Below the earth, they believed, stretched the Abzu, an endless expanse of subterranean waters from which all springs, rivers, and wells ultimately flowed. When they dug wells, when they observed springs bubbling up from beneath the ground, when they traced rivers back to their sources, they envisioned this cosmic ocean, infinite and primordial, the same waters that had existed before creation itself. The Mesopotamian plain is characterized by a remarkably high water table, and the Sumerians observed through direct experience that when they dug deep enough anywhere in their territory, they invariably found water. From this observation, they constructed a cosmology in which the entire world floated upon or was surrounded by primordial waters. The sky above was conceived as a solid dome, perhaps made of some crystalline substance, arching over earth and keeping the waters above from falling down. Below earth were the waters of the Abzu, held back by the solid foundation of the world, but always present, always threatening to break through if the cosmic order failed. Part 3. The Divine Generations. The text preserved in the electronic text, Corpus of Sumerian literature provide remarkably detailed descriptions of the early cosmic order and the generations of gods who populated it. But here's where the timeline becomes absolutely crucial. The Anunnaki, according to actual Sumerian texts, were not the first gods. They weren't even the second generation of deities. They appear relatively late in divine genealogy, as offspring of already established gods. The word Anunnaki itself does not mean those who came down from heaven to earth, as popular interpretations claim. This translation is simply incorrect. The term actually derives from Sumerian elements translating more accurately as princely blood, seed of An, or offspring of the prince, referring to their status as descendants of An the sky god. Every reputable Sumerian dictionary, every scholarly analysis confirms this etymological derivation. The early pantheon, gods before the Anunnaki. Before the Anunnaki entered mythological narrative, the texts describe a world populated by other divine beings: Nana, later known as Sin, the moon god whose monthly cycle governed the Mesopotamian calendar and whose temple at Ur was one of the most important religious centers in ancient Sumer; Utu, Shamash in Akkadian, the sun god who brought light and warmth to the world, associated with justice and truth because the sun's light revealed everything hidden; Inanna, Ishtar in Akkadian, perhaps the most complex goddess in the entire pantheon, deity of love and warfare, fertility and destruction, the planet Venus whose appearance as both morning and evening star made her seem like two different entities; Ninhursag, also known as Ninmah, Nintu, the great mother goddess associated with birth, fertility, and the nurturing of life. She played crucial roles in creation narratives, working alongside Enki to fashion humanity. These deities established the fundamental patterns of existence long before the Anunnaki appeared as a distinct group. Part 4. The Antediluvian Age. The Sumerian King List, one of the most fascinating documents to survive from ancient Mesopotamia, provides an intriguing window into the period before familiar historical narrative begins. This ancient document, composed during the third dynasty of Ur around 2100 BCE, but drawing on much older sources, begins with a remarkable statement. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. This opening establishes kingship itself as a divine institution, rather than human invention. Kingship descended from heaven was given as a gift from the gods to humanity. But then the Sumerian king list does something extraordinary. It names 8 kings who ruled before the Great Flood, antediluvian rulers whose reigns stretched across seemingly impossible spans of time. These 8 rulers, 8, governed 5 cities in succession: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar and Shuruppak, and their combined reigns totaled an astonishing 201.200 years according to traditional interpretation. The first of these antediluvian kings, Alulim, who ruled in Eridu, reigned for 28,800 years. His successor, Al-Algar, reigned for 36,000 years. The third king, Enmenluana, ruled for 43,200 years. Interpreting the impossible numbers, modern scholars have naturally struggled to make sense of these numbers, which seem to exist beyond any reasonable interpretation as actual chronological data. Some have suggested they should be understood symbolically rather than literally, that they represent qualities or achievements rather than years. Others have proposed that the term we translate as year might have represented a different unit of time, perhaps a month or even a day, which would reduce these reigns to more reasonable lengths. But there's another possibility. These antediluvian rulers may have been understood as existing in a fundamentally different temporal framework than post-flood kings, as inhabiting a kind of mythological time that operated according to different principles. The texts repeatedly emphasize a sharp distinction between the world before the flood and the world after it. Before the deluge, the rules governing existence were different. Time itself flowed differently. Life operated on different principles, with lifespans extended far beyond what would later become normal. The cities of the Golden Age. The cities themselves carried deep significance. Eridu was the first city, the place where civilization began, the location of Enki's temple, representing the ideal city, the prototype from which all others derived. Bad Tibira, whose name translates as Wall of the Copperworker, was associated particularly with metallurgy and craft production, with the technological innovations that transformed human life. Larik's significance is less clear from surviving texts, though the city appears in various incantations associated with healing and purification. Sipa was sacred to Utu, the sun god associated with justice and truth, and it housed one of the most important temples in ancient Mesopotamia, a center of learning and law. Shuruppak would become famous as the home of Ziusudra and as the city where the flood began, the last city to exist before the cosmic catastrophe. What do these cities and their impossibly long-reigning kings tell us about Sumerian understanding of prehistory? They suggest a graduated cosmology, a sophisticated view of time and existence that moved from the purely divine realm through intermediate stages toward the fully human world. The antediluvian period represented a time when gods and humans existed in much closer proximity than would later be possible. The kings who exercised kingship in the earliest times were not fully human in the way that later rulers would be. They were transitional figures, existing at the boundary between divine and mortal. Part 5. The Creation of Humanity. A crucial Sumerian text called Enki and Ninmah provides detailed information about humanity's creation, information that predates any later stories about the Anunnaki's involvement. This composition describes a time when the gods, specifically the lesser or junior gods, were burdened with the back-breaking work of creation and cosmic maintenance. They dug canals to channel water for irrigation. They piled up silt to create foundations for temples and cities. They crushed clay to make bricks for building. They cleared fields, planted crops, tended herds, and performed all the countless tasks necessary to maintain the ordered cosmos. And they complained bitterly about their toil, about the endless labor that left them exhausted and miserable. The senior gods, like An and Enlil, oversaw the work while the minor gods bore the actual toil. This divine hierarchy existed before humanity entered the picture. Enki's solution. Enki's solution to this divine labor crisis was both ingenious and fateful. He proposed creating a substitute workforce, beings who would relieve the gods of their labor. Working in collaboration with Nammu and with the birth goddess Ninmah, Enki fashioned the first humans from clay, taken from atop the Abzu, from the primordial waters themselves. This detail is profoundly significant. Humanity was formed from the most primal substance available, from clay infused with the essence of the cosmic waters that predated all ordered existence. The birth goddesses nipped off portions of this sacred clay, and through a process involving divine spittle and perhaps blood, human beings came into existence. This creation narrative predates and provides essential context for any later stories. Before modern theories about genetic manipulation, there was this older and more authentic Sumerian tradition. Humanity was created for a specific purpose: agricultural labor and the maintenance of temples, not mining operations or resource extraction. The motivation was practical from the divine perspective, relieving the gods of work they found burdensome. But the process was sacred, involving divine collaboration, primordial materials, and the transfer of something essential from the divine realm to the mortal sphere. The Divine Contest. After successfully making functional humans, Enki and Ninmah engage in a contest, a divine competition where each tries to create beings with various deficiencies, challenging the other to find appropriate roles for them in society. Ninmah creates people who are blind, paralyzed, or born with various conditions making standard work impossible. And Enki, demonstrating his wisdom and compassion, finds appropriate roles for each of them. He assigns those with vision impairments to musical performance. He finds roles for those with mobility issues in activities that don't require physical labor. This story addresses profound questions about disability, purpose, and social inclusion. It reflects a theological worldview that didn't see creation as a single perfect act, but as an ongoing process subject to adjustment and improvement. This experimental, process-oriented approach stands in stark contrast to interpretations portraying humanity's creation as deliberate genetic engineering with predetermined goals. The Sumerian text presents something far more nuanced: divine craftsmanship involving learning, trial and error, creative problem-solving, and ongoing refinement. Part 6. The Gifts of Civilization. Another crucial text called The Debate Between Sheep and Grain provides context for understanding early human existence before civilization reached its developed form. This composition describes the world before agriculture had been established, before the domestication of animals had transformed human diet and economy. In the beginning, the earth was barren. There was no grain growing in cultivated fields, no wheat or barley. There were no sheep providing wool for clothing and milk for nourishment. People went naked because they had no fibres to weave into cloth. They ate grass for nourishment like animals, drinking water from ditches and streams. This was humanity in its most primitive state, before the gods had granted them the technologies and knowledge that would enable civilization. Then, according to the text, the gods Ashnan and Lahar, who personified grain and sheep respectively, were created specifically to provide sustenance for humanity, to lift humans from their primitive state. These were gifts from the divine realm to the human world. The establishment of agriculture and the domestication of animals represented a transformation in human existence. This wasn't biological evolution. It was cultural development, the transmission of knowledge and technique from the divine realm to the mortal sphere. Enki and the world order. The text, Enki and the world order, provides an even broader picture of how the cosmos was organized. According to this composition, Enki surveyed the newly created world and recognized that proper management was essential. The cosmos required constant divine oversight to avoid falling back into chaos. So Enki assigned various gods to oversee different aspects of cosmic existence, creating essentially a divine bureaucracy. One deity was given responsibility for sweet waters, another oversaw crops and agriculture, yet another managed construction and building projects. Others controlled wildlife, kept animals in their proper places. This elaborate text reveals a Sumerian understanding of the world as requiring constant divine maintenance rather than operating automatically. The cosmos needed active management, divine attention paid to every domain of existence. The Anunnaki's true role. What role did the Anunnaki play in this organizational structure? The texts describe them as a collective group, the offspring of An, who function primarily as judges and determiners of fate rather than as managers of natural processes. They were associated particularly with the underworld, that dark realm beneath the earth where all mortals eventually travelled after death, and with the determination of human destinies. This is completely different from the role assigned to them in ancient astronaut theory. In the famous story of Inanna's descent to the underworld, the Anunnaki appear in their characteristic role as the 7 judges who condemn the great goddess to death in the realm of the dead. When Inanna descends, passing through 7 gates and losing divine power at each one, the Anunnaki sit in judgment over her. They fasten their eyes of death upon her, that terrible gaze that strips away divine immortality. Inanna dies and is hung on a hook like a piece of meat. This portrays the Anunnaki not as creators or technological beings, but as authorities over the final judgment, the ultimate fate that awaits all beings. Part 7. The Great Flood. The antediluvian cities represented the first implementation of divine social order, but this age ultimately ended by divine decree through the catastrophe of the flood. The Eridu Genesis, the oldest surviving narrative of the deluge, provides crucial details about this transitional moment. The text begins with creation, then describes how humanity multiplied across the fertile plains, filling the cities with their activity. The cities grew larger, more populous, more vibrant, and their noise, the constant tumult of human activity, the clamour of crowded cities, disturbed the gods. This detail is absolutely crucial for understanding Sumerian theology. The gods didn't decide to destroy humanity because humans were evil in a moral sense. The motivation was much more mundane. Humans were too numerous, too successful, too loud. Enlil, the powerful god of air and storms, found himself unable to sleep because of the constant tumult. The cities were too crowded, he complained. Humans were too loud, too present everywhere. And so, after consulting with other gods, Enlil made the catastrophic decision to destroy humanity with a great flood. Enki's subversion. But one god disagreed. Enki, the clever god who often appeared as more sympathetic to humanity. He recognized that humans served a useful purpose, performing the agricultural labor that the gods themselves had found burdensome. Eliminating them entirely would force the gods back to the very labor problem that had motivated human creation. Enki couldn't openly defy Enlil's decree, because divine decisions were understood as irrevocable once pronounced. But he could work around it. Enki appeared to Ziusudra, king of Shuruppak, the last of the antediluvian rulers. Different versions describe this revelation differently, sometimes through dreams, sometimes speaking through a reed wall while Ziusudra overhears. This elaborate subterfuge shows the Sumerian gods as bound by their own rules, not operating with complete freedom. The message was clear. A flood was coming. The decision was final. But you can save yourself, save your family, save representatives of all living species, save the seed of civilization. Build a great boat, Enki instructed, giving specifications about its construction. Make it watertight. Load it with animals of every kind. Prepare provisions. The deluge Ziusudra built the boat according to divine instructions. He loaded it with animals and provisions. Then the flood arrived with unprecedented violence. All the evil winds gathered together, every stormy blast from every direction. The flood swept over the cities for 7 days and 7 nights. The cities that humanity had built were submerged and destroyed. The ordered world was temporarily undone, returned to the primordial state of chaos and undifferentiated waters. When the storm finally ended, when the waters began to recede, Ziusudra opened a window. The sun god Utu sent his rays into the vessel's interior. Ziusudra emerged and immediately, before doing anything else, performed sacrifices to the gods. He butchered oxen and sheep. He burned juniper, sending its sweet aroma up to the heavens. This detail is profoundly important for understanding Sumerian religious worldview. Even though the gods had decreed humanity's destruction, even though divine action had caused the catastrophe, the proper response was worship and propitiation. The Sumerian worldview didn't include a concept of gods as purely benevolent protectors. The divine powers were recognized as capricious, sometimes helpful, sometimes hostile, but they were always deserving of respect and worship. Divine reconciliation. Enlil discovered that humans had survived. He was furious that his decree had been subverted. Enki admitted his role, stepping forward to accept responsibility and to justify his actions. He argued that humanity deserved a chance to survive, that they served useful purposes that would be lost if they were completely eliminated. The Assembly of Gods debated this crisis. Eventually, through divine negotiation, they reached an accommodation. Humanity could continue to exist, but measures would be implemented to control their population and reduce the noise. Some texts suggest this is when various biological and social limitations were imposed. Mortality itself became a fixed condition. Human lifespans were deliberately reduced. Women's fertility was regulated. Diseases and wild animals were instituted as population control measures. Ziusudra himself received special treatment. The gods granted him eternal life, allowing him to dwell in Dilmun, a mythical paradise at the eastern edge of the known world, where life continues in perfect harmony. Archaeological evidence. Archaeological evidence provides fascinating context for these traditions. Excavations at several Mesopotamian sites have revealed clear evidence of significant flooding events dating to around 2900 BCE. At Shuruppak, archaeologists discovered a substantial layer of riverine sediments deposited by floodwaters, suggesting the city was temporarily abandoned after a major inundation. Similar flood layers from approximately the same time period have been found at other cities including Kish and Ur. The flood deposits don't represent a worldwide deluge in the geological sense. They're evidence of catastrophic but geographically limited flooding in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, probably caused by exceptional combinations of heavy rain and high river levels. But for the people who experienced these floods, who watched the rivers overflow and spread across the plains for miles, who saw their fields and homes submerged, these events would have seemed genuinely world-ending. The Mesopotamian plain was effectively the entire world as far as these Sumerians were concerned. When the familiar landscape disappeared underwater, this was an apocalypse in the truest sense. The Sumerian flood myth preserves the traumatic memory of these catastrophic events, transforming them from natural disasters into theological narratives. Part 8. The Complex Cosmology. Let's examine the cosmological framework that Sumerian texts establish, because understanding this framework is essential for properly contextualizing all divine beings. The Sumerians conceived of the universe as having three main levels: a vertical structure that organized all existence. At the top was An, heaven, the domain of the sky god, the celestial sphere far above the earth where sun, moon, and stars moved in their courses. This was the source of rain, of storms, of all celestial phenomena. In the middle was Kai, the earth, the solid ground where humans and animals and plants existed, the manifest world of forms and activities. But the earth wasn't conceived as a simple flat surface. The Sumerians understood the earth as resting upon or surrounded by water, specifically by the Abzu. This subterranean realm of primordial waters represented the third major division of the cosmos. The Abzu was the realm of fresh water, the cosmic deep from which all springs, rivers, and wells ultimately flowed. Enki dwelt in the Abzu in a magnificent palace, ruling over this primordial ocean, controlling the flow of waters that sustained existence on Earth's surface. The complexity of the heavens. The texts describe the sky not as a single solid dome, but as multiple layers stacked one above another. Usually 3 heavens, but sometimes 7 in more elaborate schemes. The lowest dome of heaven, visible to humans, was made of jasper. This lowest heaven housed the stars, those points of light that appeared at night, and that the Sumerians recognized as following regular patterns across the sky. The middle dome was made of a stone called sagalmut, though we're not entirely certain what mineral this refers to. This middle heaven was the dwelling place of the Agigi, a class of gods associated with celestial phenomena. The highest dome of heaven was made of Luludanitu stone, possibly red jasper or carnelian. This was where An himself dwelt in splendid isolation, presiding over all existence. The underworld realm below Earth's surface, in addition to the Abzu with its life-giving fresh water, there was also the underworld proper, called Kur in Sumerian the land of the dead. This realm was ruled by the goddess Ereshkigal and by her consort Nergal. The underworld was consistently described as a dark and dreary place, a realm of dust and shadow where the dead existed in a grim parody of life. The dead ate only dust and clay. They dwelt in darkness without the comforting light of sun or moon. They wore feathers like birds. They were separated forever from the warmth and light of the upper world. This underworld was not a place of punishment for sinners or reward for the righteous. It was simply where all dead souls went, the inevitable destination of every mortal, regardless of their moral character. The Sumerians had no concept of heaven as reward or hell as punishment. Death was the great equalizer. The quality of a person's afterlife depended not on their moral choices, but on whether their family continued to perform proper funerary rituals, pouring libations, making offerings, speaking their name in prayers. The Anunnaki as underworld judges. The Anunnaki occupied a very specific place within this cosmological framework, particularly associated with the underworld realm, with the domain of the dead. They served as judges of the deceased, sitting in solemn assembly to determine the fate of each soul. This role is completely different from and incompatible with ancient astronaut interpretations. The texts consistently portray them as chthonic deities, gods of earth and underworld, associated with fate and judgment, not with the heavens or extraterrestrial origins. Part 9. Gilgamesh and the Quest for Immortality. The city of Uruk deserves special attention because it was home to the most famous king in all Mesopotamian literature, Gilgamesh. Uruk grew to become the largest city in the world during the late 4th and early 3rd millennia BCE, with a population that may have reached 50,000 people, an extraordinary concentration for that era. The legendary king Gilgamesh ruled Uruk sometime around 2700 BCE. He may have been a real historical figure whose deeds were later embellished, or he may have been entirely legendary from the start. The Epic of Gilgamesh, preserved in multiple versions spanning more than 1,000 years, represents one of humanity's earliest and greatest works of literature, a profound meditation on mortality, friendship, and the meaning of life. The epic describes Gilgamesh as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a demigod whose partially divine nature gave him extraordinary strength, but who remained mortal and subject to death. The death of Enkidu. The central narrative concerns his quest for immortality, following the death of his beloved friend Enkidu, a wild man, who had been created by the gods to challenge Gilgamesh, but who became his closest companion. When Enkidu dies as divine punishment, Gilgamesh is devastated by grief and terrified by his first real confrontation with mortality. If even Enkidu could die, then Gilgamesh himself must inevitably face the same fate. Refusing to accept this reality, Gilgamesh embarks on a desperate quest to find Utnapishtim, the Akkadian name for Ziusudra, the survivor of the Great Flood who had been granted eternal life. The journey takes Gilgamesh through impossible landscapes, across mountains that touch the sky, through tunnels of absolute darkness, to the garden of the gods where trees bear jewels as fruit. Finally reaching Utnapishtim, Gilgamesh demands to know how the flood hero achieved immortality. Utnapishtim recounts the story of the flood, the noise of humanity, Enlil's decree, Ea's warning, the building of the boat, the 7-day deluge, the sacrifice, and finally the special reward of eternal life. But the crucial point is that Utnapishtim's immortality was a unique event, a one-time exception that will never be repeated. There is no secret that Gilgamesh can learn and apply. The test of sleep. To prove this point, Utnapishtim challenges Gilgamesh to stay awake for 7 days and 7 nights, a test that seems simple. But Gilgamesh fails immediately. He falls asleep almost as soon as he sits down, and sleeps for 7 days. When he awakens and claims he only dozed for a moment, Utnapishtim points to 7 loaves of bread, the first mouldy and ancient, the last still fresh, demonstrating that 7 full days have passed. The message is devastating. If Gilgamesh cannot even conquer sleep, that little death that comes each night, how can he hope to conquer actual death itself? However, moved by compassion, Utnapishtim reveals one final secret. A plant that grows at the bottom of the cosmic ocean, a magical herb that can restore youth, though not grant immortality. Gilgamesh dives to the ocean floor, retrieves this precious plant, and begins the long journey back to Uruk, planning to test it before using it himself. But while Gilgamesh bathes in a pool, a serpent smells the plant's fragrance, emerges from the water, and steals it, slithering away. The snake immediately sheds its skin, becoming young again, which is why snakes can renew themselves while humans cannot. Gilgamesh sits down and weeps, recognizing the cosmic irony. Everything he has endured has been for nothing. Immortality remains beyond human reach. The meaning of mortality. The epic concludes with Gilgamesh returning to Uruk, no longer seeking to escape death but accepting his mortality and finding meaning in his mortal accomplishments. He shows his companion the walls of Uruk, massive fortifications he built to protect his people, monuments that will endure long after his death. These achievements, the epic suggests, are the only immortality available to mortals. We cannot live forever as individuals, but we can create works that outlast us. This is a profoundly humanistic conclusion for an ancient text, one that anticipates by millennia the existentialist philosophy of creating meaning in a finite existence. Part 10. Divine Healing and Medical Knowledge. The Sumerians understood disease not as a purely biological phenomenon, but as a sign of disturbed cosmic order, evidence that something had gone wrong in the relationship between divine and mortal realms. Illness could result from several causes according to Sumerian medical texts: divine punishment for offences against the gods, violations of ritual requirements, failures to make proper offerings, disrespect shown to sacred spaces, demonic possession by malevolent spirits who entered the body and caused suffering, beings from the chaotic realm beyond civilized order, sorcery performed by enemies who used magical techniques to curse their victims, natural causes like bad food or contaminated water, though even these were understood within a theological framework. The healing goddess, Gula. The primary deity associated with healing was Gula, also known as Ninisina, Ninkarak, and Bau. She was called the Great Physician, the divine healer who possessed knowledge of all cures. Gula was associated with dogs, those animals who appear in Mesopotamian art alongside this goddess. Dogs were sacred to her, partly because they were observed licking their wounds, which seemed to promote healing. Her temple at Essenes served as a healing centre, where priests trained in medical arts treated patients using combinations of herbal remedies, surgical procedures, magical incantations, and religious rituals. The medical texts that survive reveal a sophisticated system, combining empirical observation with theological interpretation. They describe symptoms with remarkable precision: fever that comes and goes in cycles, chest pains that radiate to the arm, yellowing of the skin indicating liver problems, changes in urine colour suggesting various ailments. But the treatments prescribed typically combined practical remedies with magical procedures. Apply this herbal poultice while reciting this incantation to drive away demons. Drink this medicinal tea while wearing this protective amulet. This integrated approach, treating both physical symptoms and spiritual causes, made perfect sense within Sumerian cosmology, where physical and spiritual realms interpenetrated. Medical practitioners. Two types of medical practitioners operated in Sumerian society. The ASU, or physician, focused primarily on practical treatments, herbal remedies, surgical procedures for treating wounds and setting broken bones, dietary recommendations. The Asaipu, or exorcist priest, specialized in magical and religious treatments, performing rituals to drive out demons, reciting incantations to appease angry gods, creating amulets to protect patients. Both types of healers were necessary for comprehensive treatment. A patient might consult a physician for wound care, while also engaging an exorcist to determine which god had been offended. Medical training took place primarily in temple schools, where young scribes learned to read cuneiform and studied diagnostic and therapeutic texts accumulated over centuries. The Pharmacopoeia Sumerian and later Babylonian medical texts describe hundreds of substances used for healing: minerals including salt for cleansing wounds, alum to stop bleeding, sulfur for skin conditions. Plants including willow bark, containing salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, for pain and fever, poppy derivatives for severe pain, cannabis, garlic for infections, mint for digestive problems, animal products including honey for wound dressing, now known to have genuine antibacterial properties, milk and butter, bile and organ extracts. These substances were prepared through various methods: boiling to extract active ingredients, grinding to powder, mixing with beer or wine to create medicinal drinks. The sophistication of this pharmacological knowledge shouldn't be underestimated. While the Sumerians didn't understand biochemistry, they had accumulated through centuries of trial and error a genuine body of effective treatments. Modern pharmacological research has sometimes vindicated ancient remedies, finding that substances used in Mesopotamian medicine do indeed contain compounds with therapeutic effects. Part 11. The Sacred Marriage and Fertility Rituals. Among the most important rituals in Sumerian religious practice was the sacred marriage, a ceremony performed annually to ensure agricultural fertility, to renew cosmic vitality, to maintain prosperity. This ritual involved the symbolic or perhaps actual sexual union between the king and a high priestess representing the goddess Inanna, reenacting the mythological marriage between Inanna and her consort Dumuzi. The sacred marriage took place during the New Year festival, that crucial time when the old year ended and the new year began, when the fates for the coming year were determined, when the cosmic order needed to be renewed through ritual action. Texts describing this ceremony have survived from multiple Sumerian cities, particularly from Uruk, where Inanna was the patron deity. The ritual began with elaborate preparations, the construction of a special bridal chamber decorated with precious materials: cedar wood from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, silver and gold, fine textiles and sweet-smelling oils. The king, representing the shepherd god Dumuzi, underwent ritual purification. The high priestess, embodying Inanna herself, adorned herself with the goddess's regalia: crown and jewellery, perfumes and cosmetics. The love songs. Remarkable poetic compositions have survived that were apparently sung during the sacred marriage ceremony, some of the most beautiful and explicitly erotic literature from the ancient world. These texts speak in the voice of Inanna, praising her beloved, using agricultural metaphors for sexual activity. Dumuzi responds with promises to plough her field. The frankness of this imagery reflects a theological understanding that physical fertility and cosmic fertility were intimately connected, that the generative power creating new life in fields was the same power creating new life in human bodies. The union of king and priestess wasn't seen as merely symbolic. It was understood as truly bringing divine power into the mortal realm, as channeling the creative energy of Inanna and Dumuzi, as ensuring that this divine fecundity would overflow into the natural world. Scholarly debates. Modern scholars have debated extensively whether the sacred marriage involved actual sexual intercourse or whether it was purely symbolic. The explicit language certainly suggests physical union, and some scholars argue that in Sumerian religious practice, where the boundary between symbol and reality was less absolute than in modern thought, ritual action was understood as genuinely bringing about what it represented. Others contend that the metaphorical nature of ancient religious language makes it impossible to determine from texts alone what physically occurred. What remains clear regardless is the theological principle. Fertility, agricultural, animal and human, was not automatic but required divine blessing, needed to be richly renewed each year through proper ceremony. Inanna's descent. The sacred marriage cycle was connected to another crucial narrative. Inanna's descent to the underworld, her death and resurrection, a story that enacted the annual cycle of agricultural dormancy and renewal. The story begins with Inanna deciding to descend to the underworld to attend the funeral rites of Gugalana, the bull of heaven who had been the husband of her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the dead. Before descending, she instructed her faithful minister Ninshubur on what to do if she didn't return. Wait 3 days, then go to the great gods and plead for help. Inanna then began her descent through 7 gates, each gate demanding she surrender an item of her divine power as payment for passage. At the first gate she removed her crown, at the second her lapis lazuli necklace, at the third her small lapis beads, at the fourth her breastplate, at the fifth her golden ring, at the sixth her measuring rod and line, at the seventh her royal robe. This progressive stripping represented the removal of divine power and protection. She arrived before Ereshkigal's throne completely naked and powerless. Ereshkigal and the Anunnaki sat in judgment. The Anunnaki fastened their eyes of death upon Inanna, that terrible gaze that kills even divine beings in this realm. Inanna died under their gaze, her body turned into a corpse hung on a hook. For 3 days she remained dead, her absence causing all fertility to cease. Ninshubur went to the great gods pleading for help. Enlil refused, Nanna refused. Finally, Enki agreed to rescue Inanna. He created 2 beings from the dirt beneath his fingernails, genderless creatures who could slip past the guardians of the underworld because they belonged to no category the underworld authorities recognized. These creatures found Ereshkigal in childbirth, moaning in pain. They sympathized with her suffering, groaning along with her. Moved by their sympathy, Ereshkigal offered them a gift, anything they desired. They asked for the corpse of Inanna. Ereshkigal, bound by her word, gave them what they requested. The creatures sprinkled the food of life and the water of life onto Inanna's corpse, and she revived. The price of return. But returning from the underworld required a substitute, someone to take her place. Demons accompanied Inanna as she ascended, tasked with seizing whoever she designated as her replacement. Inanna found her minister Ninshubur dressed in mourning clothes. The demons moved to take Ninshubur, but Inanna refused, saying this faithful servant could not be the substitute. She found her sons, also mourning. Again, Inanna refused. Finally she arrived at Uruk and found her husband Dumuzi sitting on a magnificent throne, dressed in fine clothes, apparently celebrating rather than mourning her absence. Enraged by what she perceived as his indifference, Inanna pointed at Dumuzi and designated him as her substitute. The demons seized him and dragged him to the underworld, but Dumuzi's sister Geshtinanna volunteered to share his fate. The final resolution was that Dumuzi and Geshtinanna would each spend half the year in the underworld, alternating. When Dumuzi was in the underworld, the earth became barren, crops withered, Animals stopped breeding, fertility departed. This was the dormant season. When Dumuzi returned and reunited with Inanna in the sacred marriage, fertility returned. Crops grew, animals multiplied, life flourished. This was the growing season. This mythological cycle provided theological explanation for the agricultural year, making sense of why fertility followed annual patterns of growth and dormancy. Part 12. The Seven Sages and Pre-Diluvian Wisdom. Sumerian tradition preserved memories of 7 great sages called the Apkallu, who lived before the flood and who brought the arts of civilization to humanity. These weren't gods, but rather semi-divine beings who served as mediators between the divine and human realms, comparable in some ways to angels in later religious traditions. The first and greatest of these sages was named Adapa, who served as priest to Enki and Eridu during the antediluvian age. Adapa possessed perfect wisdom, having been endowed by Enki with comprehensive understanding of all crafts and techniques necessary for civilized life. He knew agriculture and irrigation, construction and metalworking, fishing and navigation, ritual and magic. The story of Adapa. A famous myth describes how Adapa accidentally broke the wing of the south wind while fishing, causing the wind to stop blowing for 7 days and disrupting the cosmic order. This offense came to the attention of Anu, and Adapa was summoned to the celestial court to answer for his actions. Enki, concerned for his faithful priest, warned Adapa he would be offered the bread of life and the water of life, and he must refuse them because they were actually the bread of death and the water of death that would kill him. When Adapa arrived in heaven and stood before Anu's throne, the sky god was actually pleased with this wise mortal. Rather than punishing Adapa, Anu decided to reward him by offering him immortality, the bread of life and the water of life that would transform him from mortal to divine. But Adapa, following Enki's instructions, refused the offered food and drink. Anu was confused and perhaps insulted by this refusal. He asked why Adapa wouldn't accept immortality, and the sage explained that his master Enki had warned him the food and drink were deadly. Anu realized what had happened. Enki, not wanting to lose his best priest to the heavenly realm, had deliberately deceived Adapa. There are different interpretations of Enki's motivation. Perhaps he genuinely believed Anu intended to poison Adapa, or perhaps he selfishly wanted to keep Adapa in his service, or perhaps there was some deeper cosmic reason why humanity should remain mortal. Regardless, the result was the same. Adapa returned to Earth still mortal, having refused the one chance for a human to escape death. This story provided theological explanation for human mortality, not as punishment for sin, but as the result of deception and missed opportunity, a cosmic tragedy from miscommunication. The Apkallu tradition. The 7 Apkallu were credited with establishing the fundamental institutions of Sumerian civilization. They taught agriculture, how to select and plant seeds, when to irrigate, how to harvest and store grain. They revealed the arts of building in mud brick, how to make bricks from clay and straw, how to construct walls that would stand for generations. They transmitted knowledge of irrigation engineering, how to dig canals that brought water from rivers to distant fields. They instructed humans in metalworking, how to extract copper from ore, how to alloy copper with tin to create harder bronze. They taught writing, that revolutionary technology that allowed knowledge to be preserved beyond individual memories. They revealed magical and medical knowledge, incantations that could heal diseases, herbal remedies, ritual procedures. Each of the 7 sages was associated with one of the antediluvian cities, serving as the primary teacher for that urban center. After the deluge destroyed the antediluvian world, the Apkallu disappeared, returning to the divine realm or perhaps perishing in the floodwaters. No more such beings would be sent to teach humanity directly. Instead, human sages would arise, wise men and women who studied the knowledge the Apkallu had, taught, who preserved and transmitted this ancient wisdom through generations. But these human sages lacked the perfect wisdom of the Apkallu. The post-flood world was a diminished age, cut off from the direct divine instruction that had characterized the golden age before the catastrophe. Part 13. Temple Economics and the Development of Writing. The temple complexes that dominated Sumerian cities served as repositories for sacred knowledge, and as centers for its enactment through daily rituals and seasonal ceremonies. These weren't simply religious buildings in our modern sense, separate from economic and political activity. Sumerian temples were economic powerhouses, centers of production and redistribution, institutions that managed vast agricultural estates. The temple dedicated to Inanna in Uruk, called the Iana or House of Heaven, controlled enormous agricultural lands worked by dependent labourers who received rations in exchange for their work. The temple maintained workshops where specialised craftspeople produced textiles from wool, pottery from clay, metal goods from copper and bronze, stone carvings and cylinder seals. It operated as a major trading institution, exchanging Mesopotamian grain and manufactured goods for raw materials unavailable locally, including timber from Lebanon and Anatolia, stones from distant quarries, metals like copper from Oman, and tin from Afghanistan. Archaeological excavations of temple complexes have revealed extensive archives, thousands of clay tablets recording economic transactions in meticulous detail. These texts list deliveries of grain from specific fields, measured in standard units and credited to named farmers. They record distributions of bread and beer rations to named workers. They inventory livestock, counting sheep and goats and cattle, tracking their multiplication and diminishment. They list tools and equipment, making sure valuable metal implements weren't lost or stolen. They document the production of textiles, recording how much wool was delivered to workshops and how many finished garments were produced. The sheer volume and complexity of this record-keeping demonstrates that Sumerian temples were managing sophisticated economic operations on a scale that required writing for effective administration. The birth of writing indeed, writing itself developed precisely to meet these administrative needs, beginning as a tool for tracking economic flows before later expanding to record literature, history, laws, and religious texts. Writing emerged in Mesopotamia around 3200 BCE, according to archaeological evidence, making it one of the world's earliest writing systems along with the roughly contemporary Egyptian hieroglyphs that developed independently in the Nile Valley. The earliest Sumerian tablets that archaeologists have discovered aren't religious hymns, or mythological narratives or historical chronicles. They're accounting records, administrative documents tracking the mundane but essential flows of goods and labour. These primitive texts from the late 4th millennium BCE list deliveries of barley from specific fields to temple granaries. They record distributions of bread and beer rations to named workers. They inventory livestock with simple numerical notations. They list tools and equipment with ideographic signs that evolved into the cuneiform script. Only later, once writing had been established as a practical administrative technology, did Sumerian scribes begin using this tool for other purposes. Religious hymns praising the gods were among the first literary texts, appearing in the early 3rd millennium BCE. These compositions celebrated the deities worshipped in major temples, described their powers and characteristics, recounted their mythological deeds. Then came mythological narratives like the ones we've been examining, stories about creation and the flood and divine adventures, preserving theological traditions and cosmological understanding in permanent written form. Legal codes appeared, systematizing principles of justice and documenting penalties for various crimes, creating written standards that could be consulted and applied consistently. Historical texts emerged, recording the deeds of kings and victories of armies, celebrating military campaigns and building projects. Wisdom literature developed, collections of proverbs and teachings designed to educate scribes and transmit cultural values across generations. This trajectory from economic administration to literary and historical expression tells us something profound about Sumerian civilization and how it understood the relationship between the practical and the sacred. These were not separate domains in Sumerian thought, not distinct spheres that could be clearly separated. The temple was simultaneously a religious center and an economic hub. The sacred and the practical were intimately intertwined, divine kingship and political legitimation. The texts describe kingship as a mediating institution within this theological economic system, the linchpin connecting divine will to human action, cosmic order to social structure. The king was not himself divine in early Sumerian thought, though later rulers would sometimes claim divine status during their lifetimes or be deified after death. Instead, the king was understood as the earthly representative of the divine realm, chosen by the gods to exercise authority over human affairs on their behalf. His legitimacy derived from divine selection, from the fact that kingship had descended from heaven as a sacred gift and had been entrusted to him as the custodian of this divine institution. This explains the formula that appears repeatedly throughout the Sumerian king list. After the flood swept over the earth, kingship descended from heaven once again, and the kingship was established in Kish. This wasn't describing a literal physical descent of some object from the sky. It was expressing the theological principle that political authority had divine origins, that the right to rule came from the gods rather than from human consent or military conquest or economic power. Of course, in actual historical practice, rulers gained and held power through very human means, including military force, political alliances, economic resources, and personal charisma or administrative competence. But the ideology of divine kingship provided religious legitimation for their authority, transforming political power from mere domination backed by force into sacred office backed by cosmic order. This legitimation was mutually beneficial. It helped kings justify their authority and secure obedience, while giving priests powerful royal patrons who protected their interests and enforced their prerogatives. The king built and maintained temples, ensuring the gods had proper dwelling places. He provided resources for daily offerings and seasonal festivals. He appointed high priests and priestesses, often from his own family. In exchange, the priests proclaimed divine approval for the king's rule, performed rituals ensuring his success, interpreted omens favorably when politically convenient, and used their religious authority to reinforce political hierarchies. Part 14. Babylonian Transformations and Marduk's Ascension. The Sumerian civilization that created these myths and built these cities didn't endure forever in its original form. Around 2000 BCE, the political landscape began shifting dramatically as Semitic-speaking peoples called Amorites gained increasing power. These Amorites established a new capital at the previously minor city of Babylon on the Euphrates River in central Mesopotamia, and over several centuries they built an empire that would dominate the region. The city of Babylon eventually became the greatest urban center in all of Mesopotamia, famous throughout the ancient world for its size and wealth, its hanging gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, its massive walls, its ziggurat that may have inspired the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. The Babylonians adopted Sumerian culture wholesale, learning cuneiform writing to record their own Akkadian language, worshipping the Sumerian gods under Semitic names, studying Sumerian literature in scribal schools, maintaining traditions of temple service and divine kingship. But they also transformed what they inherited, adapting Sumerian religious ideas to fit their own cultural perspectives and political needs, creating new versions of old myths that reflected changed circumstances. The Enuma Elish, the most dramatic transformation, involved the god Marduk, patron deity of Babylon, who had been a relatively minor figure in the Sumerian pantheon, but who was elevated to supreme cosmic authority in Babylonian theology. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic composed probably around 1100 BCE, tells a creation story that differs significantly from the older Sumerian narratives we've examined. This text begins not with Nammu but with Apsu, the fresh water, and Tiamat, the salt water, already existing as primordial entities. From their mingling, younger gods emerge and immediately begin making noise, disturbing Apsu's rest. Apsu decides to destroy these noisy young gods, but Ea, the Babylonian name for Enki, discovers the plan and kills Apsu first, taking control of the freshwater realm. Tiamat, enraged by her consort's death, creates an army of monsters to avenge Apsu and destroy the gods who killed him. The younger gods panic, unable to face Tiamat's terrible forces. Marduk, son of Ea, volunteers to fight Tiamat on the condition that, if he succeeds, he will be made supreme king of all the gods, with authority exceeding even An and Enlil. The gods agree desperately, willing to grant any terms if someone will save them. Marduk confronts Tiamat in cosmic battle, defeats her with superior weapons and magic, and then performs the ultimate act of creation. He splits Tiamat's corpse in half, using one half to create the sky and the other half to create the earth. From Tiamat's body parts, Marduk fashions all the structures of the cosmos, mountains from her head, rivers from her eyes, clouds from her breasts. The universe itself is constructed from the corpse of the defeated Chaos Dragon. Then Marduk creates humanity from the blood of Kingu, Tiamat's consort and the leader of her monster army, mixing divine blood with clay to fashion beings who will serve the gods. This Babylonian creation narrative differs profoundly from Sumerian tradition in several ways. Creation comes through violence and conflict rather than through peaceful separation or divine craftsmanship. The cosmos is literally built from the corpse of a defeated enemy, making violence fundamental to cosmic order. The supreme god achieves his position through military victory rather than inheriting it through primordial genealogy. Marduk earns cosmic authority by proving himself stronger than all other gods. Humanity is created from the blood of a rebel god as punishment for that god's crimes, making humans inherently connected to chaos and rebellion, rather than being fashioned from pure primordial materials. These changes weren't random or accidental. They served specific political and theological purposes for the Babylonian Empire. Political functions, by elevating Marduk to supreme authority over all gods including the traditional Sumerian deities, the Enuma Elish provided divine sanction for Babylon's political dominance over the older Sumerian cities. If Marduk was king of the gods, then his city Babylon naturally deserved to be the capital of the empire, and its human king ruled with authority derived from the supreme god. The epic was recited annually during the New Year festival in Babylon, probably while ritual dramas reenacted key scenes, reinforcing these theological and political claims through repeated performance. The elevation of Marduk also represented a kind of religious imperialism, subordinating local deities to a supreme god who transcended regional loyalties, while allowing those local traditions to continue existing within a new hierarchical framework. Local cities could still worship their traditional patron gods. Uruk could honor Inanna, Ur could venerate Nanna, Eridu could serve Ea. But now these deities were understood as subordinate to Marduk, serving him just as their cities served Babylon politically. This religious restructuring provided ideological justification for empire, making Babylonian dominance seem natural and divinely ordained rather than the result of military conquest. Part 15. Astronomical Knowledge and Celestial Divination. One aspect of Mesopotamian civilization that demands attention is their sophisticated astronomical observation and the theological significance they attributed to celestial phenomena. The Sumerians and later the Babylonians were among the world's first systematic astronomers, tracking the movements of stars, planets, sun and moon with remarkable precision over many centuries. This wasn't idle curiosity or purely practical timekeeping, though it certainly served those functions. Astronomy was fundamentally a religious activity, a way of reading divine will written in the heavens, of understanding the cosmic order through careful observation of celestial movements. The Mesopotamians identified 5 visible planets and associated each with a particular deity. Mercury was Nammu, god of writing and wisdom, whose rapid movements reflected his role as divine scribe and messenger. Venus was Inanna, Ishtar, whose appearance as both morning and evening star made her seem like 2 different entities, reflecting her complex nature as goddess of both love and warfare. Mars was Nergal, god of war and pestilence, whose red colour suggested blood and violence. Jupiter was Marduk in Babylonian astronomy, the supreme god whose stately movement reflected his cosmic authority, whose brightness exceeded all other planets. Saturn was Ninurta, warrior god and agricultural deity, whose slow movement suggested patient endurance and steady reliability. These identifications weren't arbitrary associations, but were understood as revealing actual divine presence. The gods themselves dwelt in these celestial bodies, their positions and interactions reflecting events in the divine realm that would soon manifest in the mortal world. The Zodiac. The Mesopotamians developed the zodiac, dividing the ecliptic, the path followed by the sun through the stars across the year, into 12 sections, each associated with particular constellations. This wasn't the zodiac of modern astrology, which developed later through Greek elaboration of Babylonian foundations. The Mesopotamian zodiac differed in some details, but the basic concept was the same. The position of planets within these zodiacal constellations at particular times carried divinatory significance, revealed patterns that skilled priests could interpret to predict future events or understand present circumstances. Thousands of omen texts have survived on clay tablets, recording centuries of astronomical observations paired with their perceived earthly correlations. When Jupiter enters the constellation of the Bull, the king will secure abundant harvests. When Venus disappears from the evening sky and reappears in the morning, warfare will cease and peace treaties will be signed. When Mars approaches the constellation of the Scorpion, disease will spread through the land. These weren't superstitious beliefs in vague magical influence, but represented a sophisticated attempt to find meaningful patterns in observable phenomena, to discern order in what seemed like chaos, to gain some measure of predictive power over an uncertain future. The celestial realm was more ordered, more predictable than the terrestrial realm. The movements of stars and planets followed regular cycles that could be tracked and measured with increasing precision over generations of observation. If the gods controlled both celestial and terrestrial realms, then patterns observed in the heavens should correspond to patterns manifesting on Earth. This was the fundamental logic of Mesopotamian astrology. Not that stars caused earthly events, but that both were expressions of the same divine will, reflections of the same cosmic order. Mathematical astronomy. The Babylonians developed sophisticated mathematical techniques for predicting celestial phenomena with remarkable accuracy. They used a sexagesimal base 60 number system, which is why we still have 60 minutes in an hour and 60 seconds in a minute, direct inheritances from Babylonian mathematics. They created mathematical models that could predict lunar eclipses, solar eclipses, and planetary positions months or even years in advance, using tables of numerical coefficients that encoded the complex periodic behavior of celestial bodies. These predictive models were remarkably accurate, achieving precision that wouldn't be substantially improved until the development of Copernican astronomy and Kepler's laws in the 16th and 17th centuries. The Babylonian astronomers didn't understand the physical mechanisms underlying celestial motions. They didn't know about gravity or elliptical orbits or the heliocentric solar system. But they didn't need to understand causes to predict effects with impressive accuracy. Through centuries of meticulous observation and mathematical analysis, they discovered the regularities governing celestial phenomena and encoded them in numerical tables that allowed prediction, without requiring understanding of underlying physical laws. This represents a genuinely scientific approach: systematic observation, pattern recognition, mathematical modeling, predictive accuracy, even though it was motivated by theological rather than purely secular concerns. Part 16. The ME and cultural transmission. The concept of the me that appears in multiple Sumerian texts deserves examination because it reveals how these ancient people understood the transmission of civilization, the establishment of social order, and the divine origins of cultural institutions. The me were divine decrees or principles, fundamental patterns that governed various aspects of civilized existence. Scholars have translated this Sumerian word in different ways, sometimes as divine powers, sometimes as cultural norms, sometimes as cosmic principles, reflecting the difficulty of capturing its full meaning. Recent research has emphasized understanding the me not as abstract concepts, but as actual practices, specific rituals and procedures that had to be performed correctly to maintain cosmic and social order. The me included kingship itself, the right and ability to rule over others, the authority to command and be obeyed, the sacred office that mediated between divine and human realms. They included priesthood, the specialized knowledge required to serve the gods properly in temples, to perform rituals correctly, to interpret omens and divine will. They included truth and law, the principles of justice that allowed societies to function without descending into chaos. They included sexual intercourse and prostitution, both sacred and profane aspects of human reproduction and pleasure, recognizing that these fundamental human activities required divine sanction and proper regulation. The me encompassed art and music, the creative expressions that made life more than mere survival, that allowed humans to transcend their material needs and create beauty. They included crafts and technologies, everything from metalwork to weaving to building construction, all the practical skills that made civilization possible. They included warfare and weapons, the martial arts that allowed cities to defend themselves or to conquer neighbors, recognizing that organized violence was itself a civilizational achievement requiring divine sanction. They even included descent into the underworld, suggesting that even the journey to death had to be undertaken according to proper procedure, following established patterns. The complete list of me mentioned in various Sumerian texts numbers more than 100 separate items, covering virtually every aspect of civilized human existence, from the most exalted religious rituals to the most mundane practical activities. Inanna steals the Emmy. In the myth called Inanna and Enki, we see these divine principles in action and learn how they were transmitted from one center of power to another. The goddess Inanna travels to Eridu to visit Enki, the god of wisdom. Enki, being hospitable and perhaps susceptible to the charms of beautiful goddesses, entertains Inanna lavishly. He plies her with beer and wine, offering her drink after drink. As the god of wisdom drinks more and more, his judgment becomes increasingly impaired, his normally sharp mind dulled by alcohol. In his intoxicated state, Enki makes the catastrophic decision to give Inanna the me, to transfer these fundamental principles of civilization from his possession to hers, from Eridu to Uruk. One by one, he hands over the divine powers, kingship and priesthood, truth and falsehood, the art of lovemaking and the descent to the underworld, craftsmanship and warfare, music and writing. More than 100 me pass from Enki's control to Inanna's possession. The next morning, when sobriety returns, Enki realizes what he's done. He's given away the very foundations of civilization, transferred cosmic principles that were meant to remain in Eridu to this ambitious goddess. He desperately tries to prevent Inanna from leaving Eridu with the me, sending his minister Isimud and various magical servants to intercept her and recover these precious divine powers. But Inanna and her servant Ninshubur cleverly evade these pursuers through a series of confrontations. Each time Enki's servants catch up with her, Ninshubur defends the goddess and helps her escape. They make their way back to Uruk successfully, transporting the ME from Eridu to Inanna's own city, establishing Uruk as the new center of civilization and power in ancient Sumer. The meaning of the myth. This mythological episode served to explain why Uruk rather than Eridu became the dominant city in early Sumerian history, why political and cultural power shifted from the oldest sacred center to a newer but more dynamic urban center. But it also reveals deeper truths about how the Sumerians understood civilization and its origins. Cultural knowledge, technological expertise, social institutions, all the things that made urban life possible, were not human inventions that emerged through trial and error over long periods of time. They were divine gifts, sacred knowledge that had to be properly transmitted and carefully preserved. The me had to be obtained from the gods who originally possessed them, acquired through some combination of divine favor, clever negotiation, and sometimes outright theft, as in Inanna's case. This theological understanding of culture's origins wasn't primitive superstition, or failure to recognize human agency and innovation. It was a sophisticated way of acknowledging that civilization depended on accumulated knowledge passed down through generations, on techniques and practices that had to be learned rather than being innately known, on cultural inheritance that each generation received from ancestors and had responsibility to transmit to descendants. By attributing the me to divine origins, the Sumerians were emphasizing their sacred importance, protecting them from casual modification or thoughtless abandonment, ensuring that the fundamental patterns of civilized life would be preserved and transmitted faithfully across time. The transfer of the Emni from Eridu to Uruk represented not just a shift in political power, but a recognition that civilization could move, that sacred knowledge could be transmitted to new centers, that the patterns established at creation could be successfully replicated in new locations. Part 17. Myths of Divine Conflict and Cosmic Order. The transfer of the Emmi from Eridu to Uruk represented not just a shift in political power, but a recognition that civilization could move, that sacred knowledge could be transmitted to new centers, that the patterns established at creation could be successfully replicated in new locations. But the establishment and maintenance of cosmic order was never portrayed in Sumerian mythology as a peaceful, harmonious process. divine conflict appears repeatedly in these ancient narratives, not as aberrations or failures of cosmic design, but as necessary dynamics that drove creation forward, that separated order from chaos, that established boundaries and hierarchies essential for existence. The slaying of Kur, one of the earliest conflict narratives preserved in Sumerian literature, describes the hero god Ninurta's battle against the demon Kur, whose name literally means mountain or foreign land, but came to represent primordial chaos, the forces of disorder that constantly threatened to overwhelm civilization. Different versions of this myth exist with varying details, but the core narrative remains consistent. Kur represented a threat to cosmic order so severe that divine intervention became necessary. In some versions, Kur had kidnapped the goddess Ereshkigal, dragging her down to the underworld to become its reluctant queen. In others, Kur simply embodied the chaotic forces beyond the boundaries of civilization, the untamed wilderness, the hostile foreign territories, the destructive power of nature unleashed. Ninurta, warrior god and son of Enlil, took up arms against this threat. He was portrayed as the ideal divine warrior, strong, brave, skilled with weapons, utterly committed to maintaining cosmic order against all threats. The battle between Ninurta and Kur was cosmic in scale. They fought across mountains and valleys. Ninurta wielded the Sharur, a magical mace that could speak and fly independently, scouting ahead and reporting back to its master about enemy positions. The Sharur itself deserves attention as one of the most fascinating weapons in ancient mythology. Not a passive tool, but an intelligent companion, a weapon with its own consciousness and agency that chose to serve Ninurta in his mission to preserve order. After tremendous struggle, Ninurta finally defeated Kur, slaying the demon and establishing divine authority over the chaotic realm it had represented. But victory brought unexpected consequences. The texts describe how the slaying of Kur caused the primordial waters to overflow, threatening to flood the earth. The demon's death disrupted the cosmic balance that had kept the waters in their proper places. Ninurta had to take additional action to prevent catastrophe. He piled up stones to create a barrier, holding back the waters and channeling them in controlled ways. He established the proper courses for rivers and streams. He organized the mountain regions, determining which peaks would gather rain and snow, which valleys would channel water to the plains. This post-battle reorganization was as important as the combat itself. It wasn't enough to defeat chaos. Order had to be actively constructed and maintained through ongoing divine effort. The myth's multiple meanings. This narrative operated on several interpretive levels simultaneously, as the best myths always do. On a cosmological level, it explained geological and hydrological features of the Mesopotamian landscape. Why did rivers flow in particular directions? Why were mountains arranged in certain patterns? Because Ninurta had organized them after his battle with Kur. On a political level, it justified Mesopotamian military campaigns against foreign peoples. Just as Ninurta fought to extend divine order into chaotic realms, so human kings fought to extend civilized rule into barbarian territories. Imperial conquest became a sacred duty, a reenactment of divine precedent. On a psychological level, the myth addressed the eternal human struggle against chaos in all its forms, the constant effort required to maintain order in our lives, to keep entropy and disorder at bay, to create meaning in a universe that doesn't inherently provide it. The Bull of Heaven. Another divine conflict narrative with profound implications appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, though its roots extend back into earlier Sumerian tradition, the episode of the Bull of Heaven. After Gilgamesh rejected Ishtar's sexual advances, the goddess was furious at this affront to her dignity. No mortal had ever refused her before, and she would not tolerate such disrespect. Ishtar went to her father Anu and demanded that he give her the Bull of Heaven so she could send it to destroy Gilgamesh and Uruk. Anu initially refused, warning that releasing this creature would cause 7 years of famine, but Ishtar threatened to break down the gates of the underworld and release all the dead to consume the living if Anu didn't comply. Faced with this apocalyptic threat, Anu reluctantly agreed and gave his daughter the Bull of Heaven. The bull descended to earth and immediately began causing devastation. With its first snort, it opened huge cracks in the ground that swallowed 100 men. With its second snort, another 100 men fell to their deaths. With its third snort, even more. Gilgamesh and Enkidu fought this divine monster together in what represents one of the great heroic moments in ancient literature. Enkidu grabbed the bull by its tail, holding it in place while Gilgamesh drove his sword into its neck, killing it. The people of Uruk celebrated this victory, praising their king for protecting them. But Ishtar appeared on the walls of the city, mourning these bull and cursing Gilgamesh. Enkidu, in a moment of hubris that would seal his fate, tore off the bull's right thigh and threw it at the goddess, taunting her. This act of disrespect toward a major deity had consequences. The gods assembled in council and decreed that for killing the bull of heaven, a divine creature, one of the two heroes must die. Enkidu was chosen for punishment. The meaning of divine anger. This narrative reveals important aspects of how the Sumerians and later Mesopotamians understood divine psychology and the relationship between gods and mortals. The gods were not portrayed as perfectly rational or consistently just. They were subject to pride, jealousy, anger, and wounded dignity just as humans were, but with vastly greater power to act on those emotions. Ishtar's fury at sexual rejection seems almost petty from a modern perspective, as does her willingness to devastate an entire city and trigger years of famine simply to punish one man's refusal. But the narrative isn't presenting this as admirable behaviour. It's acknowledging a theological problem that any polytheistic system must address. If there are multiple gods with different agendas and personalities, conflicts will arise, and humans may find themselves caught in divine disputes not of their making. The story also establishes clear boundaries. Mortals could achieve great things, even defeating divine monsters, but they must maintain proper respect for the gods themselves. Enkidu's fatal mistake wasn't fighting the bull of heaven when it threatened his city. His mistake was mocking Ishtar, showing disrespect to a deity even in victory. This reflects a fundamental principle of Mesopotamian religion. Humans could appeal to gods, could even sometimes manipulate them through proper ritual and prayer, could occasionally resist divine commands through cleverness as Ziusudra did, but they could never forget their subordinate position in the cosmic hierarchy. Part 18. The Underworld and the Afterlife. The Sumerian conception of the afterlife deserves extended examination because it reveals a worldview radically different from later religious traditions that would dominate Western thought. There was no concept of heaven as reward for the righteous, or hell as punishment for the wicked. The underworld, called Kur, Irkala, or simply the Great Below, was simply where all dead souls went, regardless of their moral character or social status. This realm was consistently described in grim terms. It was a place of darkness, forever separated from the light of sun and moon. The dead ate dust and clay. They wore feathers like birds, suggesting a kind of spectral existence, neither fully substantial nor entirely incorporeal. The underworld had 7 gates, each requiring payment or the surrender of some item before passage could continue. This detail appears most famously in the story of Inanna's descent, where she progressively loses her divine powers and regalia at each gate. Ereshkigal, the Queen of the Dead, ruled this realm with absolute authority. Her word was law in her domain. Even the great goddess Inanna had to submit to her judgment when descending to the underworld. The geography of death. The Sumerians conceived of the underworld as a physical place beneath the earth, accessible through caves or through cracks in the ground, but also somehow existing in a different dimension that couldn't be reached by simply digging deep enough. Certain locations were understood as having special connections to the underworld, places where the boundary between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead was thinner, more permeable. Water sources particularly, springs and rivers, were sometimes seen as connecting to the underworld, perhaps because they emerged from beneath the earth, from the deep places where death held sway. The river that separated the living world from the realm of the dead appears in various Mesopotamian texts, though not as prominently as in later Greek tradition with the river Styx. The dead had to cross this water to reach their final destination. A ferryman appears in some versions of these myths, transporting souls across the river boundary. Ushanabi served this function in the Epic of Gilgamesh, ferrying souls across the waters of death. The same figure who would later help Gilgamesh cross these waters while still living seeking Utnapishtim, the quality of afterlife. While all souls went to the same general realm, the quality of existence there was not entirely uniform. It depended crucially on whether the living maintained proper remembrance of the dead. Those who had families to perform funerary rites, to pour libations of water, to make offerings of food, to speak their names in prayers, these dead existed in a relatively better state, sustained by the attention and offerings of the living. But those who had no family, who were forgotten, who received no offerings, these suffered a worse existence even within the already dreary underworld. They were the dead who have no one to care for them, wandering restlessly, perhaps returning to haunt the living in desperate attempts to secure offerings. This created powerful social incentives for having children and maintaining family connections. Your afterlife literally depended on having descendants who would remember you, who would perform the necessary rituals, who would ensure your continued existence wasn't completely miserable. The text describes certain categories of death as particularly unfortunate: those who died by drowning and whose bodies were never recovered, those killed in battle whose corpses weren't properly buried, women who died in childbirth, children who died before reaching adulthood. These individuals faced special difficulties in the afterlife because they hadn't received proper funerary rites, or because they'd been cut off from life prematurely before completing their natural span of years. Necromancy and communication. Despite the absolute boundary that normally separated the living from the dead, Mesopotamian tradition acknowledged that communication was sometimes possible. Certain rituals could summon the spirits of the dead to provide information to the living, particularly to reveal hidden knowledge, to identify those responsible for crimes, or to advise on important decisions. The practice of necromancy was recognized as real and potentially effective, though also dangerous. The boundaries existed for good reasons, and violating them always carried risks. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, after Enkidu's death, his spirit briefly returns to speak with Gilgamesh, describing the conditions in the underworld. Different translations vary in how they present this episode, sometimes as a dream, sometimes as an actual visitation, but the content remains consistent. The dead know the secrets of the underworld, and under certain circumstances they can share that knowledge. Dreams were understood as one of the primary means by which the dead communicated with the living. When you dreamed of deceased relatives, these weren't merely psychological phenomena or random brain activity. They were actual visitations, the spirits of the dead finding a way to reach across the boundary. Ghosts and hauntings. The Sumerians absolutely believed in ghosts. Spirits of the dead who for various reasons couldn't rest peacefully in the underworld and instead troubled the living. Extensive texts describe symptoms of ghost possession or haunting, unexplained illnesses, misfortunes that befell families repeatedly, feelings of dread or presence in certain locations. Exorcist priests specialized in dealing with these supernatural afflictions. They performed rituals to identify which ghost was causing problems, to determine why the spirit was unquiet, and to send it back to the underworld where it belonged. Often, hauntings resulted from improper burial or neglected funerary offerings. The ghost was essentially demanding attention, insisting that the living fulfill their obligations to the dead. In these cases, the solution was straightforward: provide proper burial for any unburied remains, perform the delayed funerary rites, make offerings that should have been given earlier, speak the name that had been forgotten. Other hauntings were more malevolent, spirits of those who had died violently or unjustly, who sought revenge against the living, who spread their suffering to others. These required more elaborate exorcism rituals, often involving protective amulets, magic circles, incantations that commanded the spirit to depart. Part 19. Law, Justice, and Social Order. The establishment of law represented one of humanity's greatest achievements in Sumerian thought, a divine gift that raised humans above animals, that made complex urban society possible, that created predictable order out of chaos. Several law codes have survived, from ancient Mesopotamia providing extraordinary windows into how these societies functioned and how they understood justice. The earliest known law code comes from Nammu, king of the 3rd dynasty of Ur around 2100 BCE. Though fragmentary, this code reveals sophisticated legal thinking that predates the more famous Code of Hammurabi by several centuries, the Code of Nammu. This ancient legal text begins with a prologue establishing the divine legitimation of law and royal authority. Nammu didn't create laws through his own wisdom or power. He was appointed by the gods specifically to establish justice, to protect the weak from the powerful, to ensure that society functioned according to divine principles. The code specifies punishments for various offences, and notably, many of these punishments involve monetary compensation rather than physical retribution. If a man severed another man's foot, he had to pay 10 shekels of silver in compensation. If he severed a nose, 2/3 of a mina of silver. Different body parts had different values, reflecting a systematic attempt to quantify harm and establish proportional restitution. If a man's virgin daughter was raped, the rapist had to pay compensation to her father, an approach that disturbs modern sensibilities because it treats the woman as property. But that represented an attempt to provide some remedy for harm within the cultural framework of that era. If a man accused another of sorcery but couldn't prove the accusation, the false accuser had to pay penalties. This protected people from malicious accusations while acknowledging that sorcery was understood as a real threat requiring legal remedies. The code addressed slavery, establishing that slaves could marry, could own property, could testify in certain legal proceedings. Slavery in Sumerian society was not the racial chattel slavery of later periods, but often resulted from debt. People sold themselves or family members into slavery to repay obligations, with the expectation that freedom might eventually be regained. The protection of widows and orphans. A recurring theme throughout Mesopotamian legal texts is the obligation to protect society's most vulnerable members, specifically widows and orphans who lacked male family members to defend their interests. This wasn't sentimental charity, but reflected a sophisticated understanding that justice required active intervention to prevent the powerful from exploiting the weak. The prologue to the Code of Nammu explicitly states that the king did not deliver up the orphan to the rich man, he did not deliver up the widow to the mighty man. This principle appears repeatedly in royal inscriptions, in religious texts praising just rulers, in hymns to gods associated with justice. It represented a core value of Mesopotamian civilization, perhaps honoured more often in breach than in observance, as ideals often are, but nevertheless articulated as essential to proper social order. The Code of Hammurabi. The most famous Mesopotamian law code comes from Hammurabi, king of Babylon who ruled around 1750 BCE. His code, preserved on a massive stone stele now in the Louvre, contains 282 legal decisions covering virtually every aspect of Babylonian life. The stele itself is a remarkable artifact. At the top, a relief sculpture depicts Hammurabi receiving the laws from Shamash, the sun god of justice. This visual representation emphasizes the divine origin of law. Hammurabi was the promulgator, but the actual source was the gods themselves. The Code of Hammurabi is famous for its principle of proportional justice, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Though this represented a limitation on vengeance rather than a requirement for brutality, justice should be proportional to the offence, neither exceeding it nor falling short. However, the code also reveals sharp class distinctions in how justice operated. The same offence received different punishments depending on the social status of perpetrator and victim. If a nobleman struck another nobleman's daughter and caused a miscarriage, the offender's daughter would be killed in retaliation, not the offender himself, reflecting the principle that harm to property, daughters were legally property of their fathers, should be answered with equivalent harm. But if a commoner's daughter miscarried due to being struck, the offender paid only a monetary fine. The life of a commoner's daughter was legally valued less than that of a noblewoman. These distinctions disturb modern egalitarian sensibilities, but they represented the legal codification of social hierarchies that ancient Mesopotamians understood as natural and divinely ordained. Commercial law. Extensive sections of Mesopotamian law codes dealt with commercial transactions, reflecting the sophisticated market economy that developed in these urban centres. Laws regulated contracts for the sale of property, of slaves, of agricultural products. They established standard weights and measures, making trade more predictable and reducing opportunities for fraud. They defined the responsibilities of merchants, of agents conducting business on behalf of principals, of creditors and debtors. They established procedures for resolving disputes when contracts were breached or when goods proved defective. The laws addressed theft with particular attention, establishing different penalties depending on what was stolen and from whom. Stealing from a temple or palace was a capital offence, reflecting the sacred and royal character of these institutions. Stealing from a commoner resulted in compensation, typically returning multiple times the value of what was taken. If stolen property couldn't be recovered and the thief couldn't pay compensation, the thief was executed. Property rights were taken very seriously, protected by the ultimate sanction available to the state. Family law, the codes, also extensively regulated family relationships, establishing rights and obligations for husbands and wives, parents and children, legitimate offspring and illegitimate. Marriage was fundamentally a contract, typically arranged by families rather than by the individuals involved. The groom's family paid a bride price to the bride's family, compensating them for losing her labour. The bride's family provided a dowry, goods and property that remained under the wife's control even after marriage. Divorce was possible under certain circumstances. A husband could divorce his wife relatively easily, though he had to return her dowry and often pay additional compensation. A wife could divorce her husband if he neglected her, failed to provide support, or committed certain offences, though the threshold for women to initiate divorce was higher than for men. Adultery was treated as a serious offence, particularly for women. A wife who committed adultery could be executed along with her lover, though a husband had the right to pardon her if he chose. A husband's extramarital affairs were treated less severely, reflecting the deep gender inequalities embedded in these legal systems. Children's inheritance rights were carefully regulated. Legitimate sons received equal shares of their father's estate, divided among them after his death. Daughters received dowries when they married, but typically didn't inherit land or other major property. Illegitimate children had limited rights, though they could be legitimated if their father formally recognized them. Adopted children had full rights if the adoption was properly executed according to legal procedures, divine justice and human law. It's crucial to understand that Mesopotamian legal systems weren't conceived as purely human institutions separate from religious authority. Law came from the gods. Justice was a sacred principle, not merely a social convention. The gods demanded that humans establish and maintain just societies, and they would punish entire communities if rulers failed to uphold justice. Natural disasters, military defeats, plagues, famines — these weren't merely unfortunate events but could be understood as divine punishment for social injustice, for failures to protect the vulnerable, for corruption among those charged with administering law. This created a theological accountability that complemented and reinforced human legal structures. Even if a powerful person could evade human justice through bribery or intimidation, they couldn't escape divine judgment. The gods knew all secrets, saw all crimes, and would ultimately ensure that justice prevailed. If not in this life, then in the determination of fate in the underworld, or through curses that would afflict descendants. This belief in cosmic justice operating beyond human institutions provided comfort to the oppressed and ideally restrained the powerful, reminding them that their actions had consequences they couldn't escape. Part 20. Legacy and Influence. As we near the conclusion of this extraordinary journey through Sumerian creation narratives and cosmology, we must address a question that has likely been forming throughout. Why does any of this matter? Why should we care about myths created by a civilization that disappeared millennia ago, that left no direct descendants, that was forgotten for thousands of years until archaeologists rediscovered their cities beneath desert sands? The answer is both simple and profound. These texts represent humanity's first written attempts to understand the fundamental questions that still preoccupy us today. Where did we come from? What is our purpose? Why do we die? How should we organize society? What obligations do we have to each other? The Sumerians were asking our questions, and while their answers emerge from a radically different cultural context, from a pre-scientific worldview we no longer share, they demonstrate that the human impulse to seek meaning, to create order, to transcend our individual mortality through cultural achievement, These are not modern innovations, but ancient inheritances. The biblical connection. The most obvious legacy of Mesopotamian mythology appears in the Hebrew Bible, which was compiled during and after the Babylonian exile, when Jewish scribes were directly exposed to Mesopotamian cultural traditions. The similarities between the Sumerian flood narrative and the biblical story of Noah are impossible to ignore and have been extensively documented by scholars. Both describe a divine decision to destroy humanity with a flood. Both feature a righteous man warned by God to build a boat. Both specify dimensions for the vessel. Both describe loading animals. Both mention the sending of birds to test whether land had emerged. Both conclude with sacrifice and divine promises. The differences are equally instructive. The biblical narrative is monotheistic, attributing all action to a single God, rather than to competing divine counsels. The motivation becomes moral, humanity's wickedness, rather than aesthetic, humanity's noise. The flood becomes global rather than regional. The theological message shifts from capricious divine anger to justified divine judgment. But the core narrative structure clearly derives from Mesopotamian sources, transmitted through cultural contact and adapted to fit Israelite monotheism. Similarly, the biblical creation account in Genesis bears unmistakable marks of Mesopotamian influence. The separation of primordial waters, the creation of humanity from earth, clay, the establishment of agricultural labour as human purpose, the garden paradise, compare Eden to Dilmun, the forbidden knowledge, the expulsion into mortality, all these elements have Mesopotamian precedents. The biblical account transformed these elements, removed their polytheistic framework, and embedded them in a radically different theological system. But the connections remain visible to anyone who examines both traditions carefully. Greek and Roman inheritance. The cultural influence of Mesopotamian mythology also flowed westward into Greek and subsequently Roman civilization through various channels, trade contacts, cultural exchanges, and the later Persian Empire's transmission of older Mesopotamian traditions. The Greek conception of cosmic order emerging from primordial chaos shows Mesopotamian influence. The Titanomachy, the war between older and younger generations of gods, echoes Mesopotamian narratives of divine conflict and succession. Specific mythological elements travelled. The descent to the underworld appears in Greek myth, Persephone's abduction, Orpheus seeking Eurydice. The quest for immortality, Gilgamesh, parallels the labours of Heracles. Divine intervention in human affairs, gods taking sides in wars, the capricious nature of divine favour, all these became fundamental to Greek mythological thinking and may have been influenced by earlier Mesopotamian conceptions. The Greek underworld, that grim realm of shadows where all souls go regardless of merit, bears striking resemblance to the Sumerian conception rather than to later ideas of heaven and hell based on moral judgment. Even certain specific images travelled. The goddess Ishtar Inanna passing through 7 gates and being progressively stripped of power finds echo in later mystical traditions, in Gnostic texts describing the soul's descent through planetary spheres, in medieval allegories of spiritual journey. The foundation of civilization. Perhaps most importantly, the Sumerians established the fundamental institutions and technologies that made all subsequent civilizations possible. Writing itself, that revolutionary technology for preserving knowledge across time and transmitting it across space, was a Sumerian innovation, developed to meet the administrative needs of temple economies, but quickly expanding to record the full range of human thought and experience. Without writing, we would have no history, no science, no accumulated wisdom beyond what could be transmitted orally through limited human memory. Every subsequent literate civilization owes an incalculable debt to those ancient Sumerian scribes who first pressed wedge-shaped marks into soft clay. Urban civilization, with all its complexity and contradiction, the concentrated populations that enabled specialization, the monumental architecture expressing collective identity, the hierarchical organization managing complex societies, the art and literature flourishing when people had leisure beyond mere survival, all this began in ancient Sumer. Organized religion as we know it, with permanent temples, professional priesthoods, elaborate rituals, systematic theology, written sacred texts, These too are Sumerian innovations, establishing patterns that would be endlessly replicated and adapted by later traditions. Law codes establishing rights and responsibilities, protecting the vulnerable, at least in theory, creating predictable social order through written standards rather than arbitrary power. These emerged in ancient Sumer and Babylon, providing models for all subsequent legal systems. Mathematical and astronomical knowledge, accumulated through centuries of careful observation and transmitted through specialized educational institutions, established intellectual traditions that would eventually evolve into science as we know it. Modern relevance. What can these ancient myths teach us today, living as we do in a radically different world of science and technology, of global communications and space exploration? First, they remind us that the questions we ask about existence, meaning and purpose aren't new. Humans have always wondered about our origins, our place in the cosmos, our relationship to forces beyond our control. The specific answers change with cultural context and accumulating knowledge, but the questions endure. Second, they demonstrate that every civilization creates narratives to make sense of existence. We still do this, we've simply changed the form. Our creation narratives now involve Big Bang cosmology, stellar nucleosynthesis, planetary formation, abiogenesis, evolution. These are better answers in that they correspond more accurately to observable reality, but they serve similar psychological functions, locating ourselves in cosmic context, understanding how we came to be, finding meaning in our temporary existence. Third, they show us how deeply cultural narratives shape social organization. The Sumerians' religious beliefs about divine hierarchy justified and reinforced human social hierarchies. Our own narratives about human rights, equality, individual dignity, these too are culturally constructed meanings we've chosen to embrace, not objective features of reality that we simply discovered. Recognizing this doesn't diminish their value. If anything, it increases our responsibility to consciously create narratives that promote human flourishing, that protect the vulnerable, that extend dignity to all people. Fourth, they reveal the eternal human struggle to maintain order against chaos, meaning against entropy, civilization against the wilderness. The Sumerians knew that the cosmos required constant maintenance, that divine effort was necessary to keep the waters in their proper places, that vigilance was required to prevent collapse back into primordial chaos. We understand these threats differently now: climate change, ecological collapse, social breakdown, nuclear war. But the fundamental insight remains: order is not natural or automatic. It must be actively created and maintained through conscious effort, through institutions and practices that prevent dissolution. The scholarly recovery. Finally, we should acknowledge the remarkable scholarly achievement that makes any of this discussion possible. For thousands of years, Sumerian civilization was completely forgotten. Their cities lay buried beneath desert sands. Their language was dead, spoken by no one, readable by no one. Their myths and legends survived only in transformed versions adopted by successor cultures. The recovery of this lost civilization represents one of the great intellectual achievements of the 19th and 20th centuries. Archaeologists excavating tells in Iraq and Syria, linguists painstakingly deciphering cuneiform script, reconstructing dead languages through comparison and inference, historians contextualizing fragments, connecting scattered pieces into coherent narratives. Thousands of scholars working over generations have given us back this lost world, have made it possible for us to hear these ancient voices speaking across 5,000 years, telling us how they understood existence and how they grappled with the eternal questions. This work continues. New tablets are still being discovered, read, translated, interpreted. Our understanding of Sumerian civilization continues to evolve and deepen as evidence accumulates and analytical tools improve. Each generation of scholars brings new perspectives, asks new questions, sees patterns that earlier researchers missed. The Sumerians continue to speak to us, and we continue learning to listen more carefully. The eternal return. As we conclude this journey through Sumerian creation mythology, we return to where we began, to Nammu, the primordial waters, the cosmic ocean holding all potential before anything had been actualized. In a sense, every civilization emerges from its own primordial waters, the undifferentiated chaos of possibility before culture creates distinct forms, before language carves reality into named categories, before stories give meaning to raw existence. The Sumerians emerged from their primordial waters, literally from the marshlands and floodplains of southern Iraq, and created something extraordinary. They built cities that endured for millennia. They developed technologies and institutions that shaped all subsequent human history. They created literature and art that still moves us across the vast gulf of time. And then, eventually, their civilization collapsed. The cities were abandoned, the temples crumbled, the canals silted up. The desert reclaimed what had been wrested from it with such effort. The cosmic order they had worked so hard to maintain could not be sustained forever. Everything returns to chaos eventually. But the ideas survived, transformed, adapted, incorporated into new cultural contexts, but traceable back to those original sources. The stories continued being told, though the storytellers no longer knew where the stories came from. And now, through the miracles of archaeology and linguistics, we can reach back across 5 millennia and recover something of what was lost. We can hear those ancient voices again, read their words, understand their thoughts. This is what makes us human, not just our ability to create meaning, but our ability to preserve it, to transmit it, to build on what previous generations accomplished, to remember what would otherwise be forgotten. The Sumerians knew they would die. They knew their cities might fall. They knew that nothing lasts forever, but they also knew that through their accomplishments, through the walls they built, through the tablets they inscribed, through the traditions they established, something of themselves could transcend individual mortality and reach into a future they would never see. They were right. Here we are 5,000 years later, still reading their words, still considering their ideas, still marveling at what they achieved. In the end, perhaps that's the most important message these ancient myths have for us. We are part of something larger than ourselves, something that extends backward into a deep past and forward into an unimaginable future. We inherit the achievements of those who came before us, and we have a responsibility to transmit something valuable to those who will come after. The Sumerians gave us writing, cities, law, literature, religion, science. They gave us the fundamental tools and institutions of civilization. What will we leave for those who follow us 5,000 years from now? What stories will they tell about our struggles to create order from chaos, meaning from randomness, justice from power? These are the questions the ancient texts invite us to consider, not just who we were, but who we are becoming, not just where we came from, but where we're going. And in that sense, the Sumerian creation narratives aren't really about the past at all. They're about the eternal present, the perpetual challenge of being human, of creating meaning in a universe that doesn't provide it automatically, of building something that might endure. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the earliest written records of human civilization. I hope you found it as fascinating and thought-provoking as I have. If you'd like to explore these topics further, I encourage you to seek out translations of the original texts, to read the scholarly literature, to visit museums where Sumerian artifacts are displayed, to continue asking the questions that the Sumerians first asked 5,000 years ago. The conversation continues, the stories are still being told, and you're now part of that ancient tradition, that chain of transmission reaching back to humanity's first civilizations and forward into whatever future we create. May you find wisdom in these ancient voices, and may you carry that wisdom forward into your own life and share it with others who seek understanding. Until next time, thank you for watching, and may your own journey through existence be filled with meaning and purpose.